Hello, I'm Shihoko Gerto with the Wilson Center's Asia program. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Just over a month has passed since Russia invaded Ukraine. How this conflict will end, when there will be a ceasefire, remains to be seen. But the impact of the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia has had an impact far beyond the borders of the two countries and beyond the United States and Europe. While no Asian country is directly engaged in the conflict, developments concerning Ukraine may well have lasting consequences to the regional order and relations not just between the Indo-Pacific and the West, but amongst nations of the Indo-Pacific too. It has certainly already led to a reconsideration of regional security interests, strategic partnerships, and economic development priorities within the Indo-Pacific. I'm excited to be joined today by my colleagues and those closely associated with the Wilson Center's Asia program to discuss the impact of the evolving situation in Ukraine across the Indo-Pacific and whether the conflict may actually contribute to a widening of the divide within the region. Let me start off the conversation by turning first to Japan and Tokyo's response to date. Japan, of course, is still the only Asian country amongst the G7 nations, and it was the first country in the Indo-Pacific to align with the United States and Europe to what has essentially become engaging in an all-out economic war against Russia. Tokyo's hardline stance against Moscow includes imposing a slew of hardline economic sanctions, cutting exports of critical technologies, including semiconductors and telecommunications supplies to Russia, freezing the assets of oligarchs, suspending travel of targeted individuals. In addition, the Kishida administration has made a point of vocalizing strong opposition to Russian aggressions. The government of Japan's actions, as well as its rhetoric, are in concert with the United States and Europe. And Tokyo's strong response against Russia has been particularly welcome in Washington. Japanese public opinion in defense of Ukraine has been notably strong as well, and it's even led to open discussions about accepting refugees and asylum seekers, which has traditionally been a divisive topic in Tokyo with very limited political support. Bear in mind, though, that Japan has usually taken a softer approach to Russia, most notably when Putin occupied Crimea in 2014, as Tokyo focused more on concluding a peace treaty to end World War II and negotiating a deal with Moscow to push for a return of the so-called Northern Territories or Kuril Islands in exchange for economic development of the islands. In fact, during his 8 years in office, Prime Minister Abe has focused on improving relations with Russia to that end, and had engaged directly with Putin a total of 27 times during his premiership. Tokyo has been dependent on Russian exports too. Japan imports about 9% of its liquefied natural gas, 12% of thermal coal from Russia as well. Russia is also a big source of seafood imports, especially crab. Japanese consumers and businesses have already seen energy prices surge as a result of the sanctions imposed by Tokyo. The price of fish has gone up too, especially since Japanese air carriers are currently unable to fly over Russian airspace, making imports from Western Europe more costly as well. That's especially alarming at a time when Japanese voters are heading to the polls for the upper house elections this summer. Japan has already paid a hefty price politically for the sanctions too. Last week, Russia declared it can no longer continue to engage in peace talks with Japan, which also means that territorial negotiations between Japan and Russia have been put on hold as well. But the impact of, but that's really not all. As a country that is geographically closest to Taiwan outside of the PRC, Japan has been closely monitoring how the ongoing situation in Ukraine and the international response to Russia will impact China's interests in Taiwan. Reunification with Taiwan, of course, remains one of the 5 core interests expressed by the Chinese Communist Party. Some analysts have argued that Russia's difficulties in bringing a swift, successful conclusion to its campaign against Ukraine will push China to reconsider its plan to take military action against Taiwan. What is clear is that many Tokyo analysts, as well as former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, have argued that Taiwan's ambiguous status in the international community and the deliberate strategic ambiguity taken by its supporters, including the United States, is making Taiwan even more vulnerable to Chinese aggression than Ukraine has been to Russian aggression. Ukraine's abandonment of nuclear weapons 3 decades ago has also been seen to make the country more vulnerable to Russian aggression too. As a result, there is greater debate in Tokyo not only about the possibility of stepping up its support for Taiwan, but also for enhancing its own defense capabilities, including strengthening its security alliance with the United States, of course, but also bolstering its own defense spending. Japan is expected to update its national security strategy later this year. And however the situation unfolds between now and then, Russia's invasion of Ukraine will highlight the need for Japan to invest more efficiently and effectively and more creatively to ensure that its own security and the stability of the region at large is preserved. So with that, I'd like to turn to Michael Kugelman, a Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia, for his comments on India.
Well, thanks a lot, Chihoko. Great to be here with colleagues present and past alike. India's position on the Ukraine crisis has been one of caution. India has not condemned Russia. It has not condemned the invasion. It has abstained from every UN resolution on the Ukraine war. But India has also called for de-escalation, diplomacy, and dialogue, and it has called for respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. This is not a new position that India is taking. It's the position that India has always taken at moments of Russian aggression. So over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of debate and commentary on why India has taken this position. But in my view, it all boils down to something very simple, and that is arms. India's heavy dependence on Russian arms. India relies on Russian arms for up to 75, even 80% of its arms. Even though it has diversified its sources of supply in recent years, France, Israel, and of course the US, India continues to rely heavily on Russia. India's reliance on Russian arms is intensified by New Delhi's belief that it faces immediate security threats from both its Pakistani and Chinese rivals. Many Russian arms, in fact, have helped strengthen India's capabilities to deter Pakistan and China. So the bottom line is that India cannot risk jeopardizing its access to Russian arms. It does not have the luxury of simply turning off the tap and looking for alternatives, and especially because its own domestic defense production system is not in a position to fill the gap. And neither are India's other arms partners, at least not in the near to midterm. There are several other factors as well driving India's position on Russia. One is the nature of its special relationship with Russia. India views Russia as a long-standing, critical, trusted partner, and one that has gone to bat for India on the global stage on many occasions, including at the UN, where Russia's voting record has benefited India's interests, including on the Kashmir issue. Another reason for India's position on Russia is its position of, or its principle of strategic autonomy, which is a modern day successor to the non-alignment idea. India believes that in order to maximize strategic flexibility and independence in its foreign policy, it cannot align itself with a particular camp on important foreign policy issues. This includes not aligning itself with the US and West on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So these are the strategic reasons that guide India's position. But I'd really argue that it's that much more tactical factor of arms that is the much more powerful explainer for India's position. So what does India's position on the crisis mean for its relations with the US? India's fence sitting on the Ukraine crisis, I think, presents a much bigger diplomatic gamble for India now than in the past in the context of its impact on US-India relations. And I'll identify 3 reasons why. First, This is a particularly egregious Russian aggression, of course, one of the most egregious in decades. Second, US-India relations have been experiencing exponential growth since the early 2000s, and they're arguably stronger now than at any time in the past. The US expectations of India have changed. Third, the Biden administration has emphasized democratic values and democracy promotion in its foreign policy. So it would like to see India condemn Russia and align with the US position, not just because India is a very close partner of the US, but also because it's a democracy. Just last week, a senior State Department official, Victoria Nuland, made a very significant comment in an Indian TV interview. She said that, quote, democracies must stand together and evolve their position. And India is one of the democracies she was referring to. And I think that's the first time that a US official has publicly called on India to change its position, and because it's a democracy. All this said, and I'll start to conclude here, the relationship with the US, despite these challenges, will endure, and for two main reasons. One, as I said earlier, this is a relationship that's grown significantly over the last 20 years. This has given it the insulation to withstand shocks. It has amassed significant amounts of trust and goodwill. There are regular mechanisms for dialogue, starting at the highest level and moving on down. The next round of the 2+2 dialogue, where the two defense and foreign ministers meet, will be happening in April. There is broad-based cooperation across a variety of security and non-security spaces, meaning that you don't have a relationship made fragile because of a dependence on cooperation in only a few areas. Second, the glue that binds the US-India relationship together, that being shared concerns about Chinese power, remains in place. And for all the talk of the risk of the war in Ukraine causing the US to downgrade its competition with China in order to focus more on Russia, well, I think we got a very key data point the other day with the release of the Pentagon's new defense strategy. And this new strategy affirms that China continues to be, quote, our most consequential strategic competitor and the pacing challenge for the department. So in effect, the Pentagon has provided a doctrinal justification for keeping China at the forefront of US strategic thinking, meaning that the idea of continued deep partnership with India will remain a strategic imperative. So to conclude, all this said, if there's one signpost we should be aware of that will give us a sense of where things are going with US-India relations in the immediate term, it would be on the issue of future India-Russia arms trade. India is not going to reduce its dependence on Russian arms. The US will certainly want it to, especially with new rounds of sanctions on Russia. So how do the two sides square that circle? And especially if you consider that India is still hoping to get a sanctions waiver from the US on its acquisition of a missile defense package from Russia last year. So these are issues worth following for sure. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. Let me now turn to Prashant Parameswaran. He is a global fellow with the Wilson Center and also deputy head of research at Bell Group Asia. And he'll be discussing ASEAN, Indonesia, Philippines, and Singapore in particular.
Great, thanks, Shihoko. So I guess if Michael was saying that you could summarize India's response in one word, which is caution, I would say in Southeast Asia, as I think both myself and then Lucas will talk about some of the other countries in mainland Southeast Asia, the one word I would use is probably diversity. There's really a full spectrum of responses in Southeast Asia with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Just starting out with ASEAN and the sort of regional perspective, I think we saw a little bit of concern when ASEAN came out with a joint statement as an institution saying that they acknowledged the fact that Russia had invaded Ukraine, but they did not use the Russia as a country, and they did not use invasion as a word. And this sort of hedging approach really captures that diversity of responses. And I think with the ASEAN diplomats who were involved in the crafting of the statement, they were actually surprised that they were able to come up with a statement at all in response to the crisis, which really speaks to the difficulties of kind of forging a unified response. And I think in Southeast Asia, there's a whole range of issues and questions on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think one basket is sort of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Some of these countries are very small countries that really value their own place in the international system and rules and the like. And I think another basket of concerns is just pure military and economic linkages to Russia and also Ukraine. Some of them are very commodity rich and dependent economies. Others rely on supply chains globally and are very trade dependent. So I think that's kind of the sort of regional landscape. And I would say this is also happening in the context of a US ASEAN summit, a special US ASEAN summit that was supposed to be held in Washington, D.C. by the Biden administration as part of its wider Indo-Pacific strategy, which got postponed. And I think, as the Biden administration considers when to hold this meeting and the agenda comes up, whether it's private discussions or public discussions, I suspect that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and some sort of comment from the Southeast Asian side in public-private discussions will be really important to watch. I would say just sort of going down the list of countries, you probably start with Singapore, where you saw the most forward-leaning response. Shihoko mentioned Japan. Singapore is the other country that came out very clearly in terms of unilateral sanctions directed at Russia. And Singapore sort of branded this as being part of its own, for its own interests, right? The fact that it's a small country that's very cognizant of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that's, I think, extremely true, but I think it also provided an opportunity for Singapore to align itself closely with the United States. And you saw that with Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong's visit to Washington, which is going on now. He'll be going to New York as well, where he very clearly in his engagement with President Biden talked about why Singapore was doing this, and also some of the regional and international concerns that Singapore has, issues with respect to bifurcation of supply chains, issues regarding international cooperation and international institutions. This existed for years before, but I think Singapore is deeply concerned about that. He also spoke about at the Council on Foreign Relations today about some of the implications on Taiwan, on Japan, Northeast Asia security. So I think that kind of represents some of the concerns that you see in Southeast Asia from some of the more forward-leaning countries. And then you have a country like the Philippines, which is a treaty ally of the United States. But I think, as we're all aware, in the past 6 years under President Rodrigo Duterte, you've seen the Philippine president essentially move away from the United States and much closer towards China and Russia. And that includes some arms deals that have been reached between the Philippines and Russia, and some aspects of security cooperation that the Philippine military and security establishment has actually tried to reject. I mention that because that's kind of a mixed response that the Philippines has had. The Philippine ambassador to the United States has said, the Philippines is open to actually providing the United States with access to some sort of presence, militarily and security-wise, if the United States needs it to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this is also a very interesting time in U.S.-Philippine relations, because we have a U.S.-Philippine election coming up in May. And President Duterte will be ending his term in office. So the question really is, where is Philippine foreign policy on this issue of the balance between the alliance with the United States and then the Duterte's sort of pivot away from the US and towards China and Russia? What will a future Philippine administration do in that respect? And I think the last country I'll mention on maritime Southeast Asia is Indonesia. And Indonesia is a really interesting case. I wouldn't say it's directly analogous to India, but it's probably the closest country in Southeast Asia that approximates that, in terms of the fact that the Indonesians are relying on Russia and have relied on Russia traditionally for arms and weapon supplies, and a very diverse portfolio. So there's a number of countries that they rely on, including the United States. But I think it's been a challenge for Indonesia in terms of what they're saying publicly. So they've supported the UN General Assembly resolution, but the Indonesians have rejected, at least to this point, more forward-leaning moves, like Indonesia is chairing the Group of 20 or the G20 this year. And they've said they're not willing to publicly say that they're not going to invite Russia to the G20 summit at the end of this year. I think the Indonesians are hoping that perhaps the crisis will abate a little bit by the end of the year, that they won't have to constantly be talking about Russia. They would prefer to focus on much more tangible issues that accord with Indonesia's domestic interests. Indonesian President Joko Widodo is very domestic focused in terms of things like infrastructure, sustainability, and the digital domain. But I think that's something that the Indonesians have to confront as a geopolitical headache in that respect. And I think that's going to color US relations with Indonesia as well. Indonesia has a very long campaign election season like we do in the United States. So they're actually already planning for their next election in 2024. So it's a really interesting domestic context as well for Indonesia. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prashant. Let me now turn to Lucas Myers, Program Coordinator for the Asia Program and the Associate for Southeast Asia.
Thanks, Shihoko. So Thailand and Vietnam will be the countries that I'm focusing on today. And there's a bit of a noticeable difference between their responses and those in maritime Southeast Asia. Largely, I would say, out of this rejection of the framing of democracy versus autocracy in great power competition, and the desire to remain non-aligned vis-a-vis other great powers. As such, you can see that their responses are a bit more restrained than others, especially compared to Singapore. And this is especially true of Vietnam, which has extensive ties to Moscow, dating all the way back to the Cold War. Yet you can still see some concern in both countries with the precedent set by Russia's invasion. More specifically about Thailand, while the government in Bangkok is a US treaty ally, it is also a military-dominated illiberal regime, and it dislikes a US rhetorical emphasis on democracy and human rights norms. And you can see this in its unwillingness to hold the junta in Myanmar accountable after the 2021 coup there. So following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Thailand initially expressed deep concern, but it avoided assigning blame to Moscow and adopted a relatively neutral position. Indeed, the Thai government rejected a request from 25 Western ambassadors to Thailand to condemn Russia, and it cited a need to maintain balance in this rejection. But interestingly, Thailand ultimately opted to vote to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the UN General Assembly vote, which its representative to the UN explained resulted from the importance that Bangkok attaches to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, which Prashant had mentioned as a key element in the response in Southeast Asia. And this is an important signal because this is much more critical of Russia than its initial response would indicate. And you can see the reason why Thailand views these principles so importantly is it's because of its place as a middle power in a neighborhood that's increasingly at the forefront of great power competition. The precedent that Russia's invasion sets for Ukraine is something that concerns smaller countries. And so there is some desire to push back on this. However, it's also important to note that Thailand does not really view the People's Republic of China as a security threat, and indeed it's increasingly a close security partner. But overall, the undermining of the norm of state sovereignty and territorial integrity is not something that's really that welcome in Thailand. Vietnam, on the other hand, opted to abstain in this UN vote and maintain a much more pro-Russian stance, although it's still neutral. Now, it's an abstention, which is not a yes vote, and it's not the kind of full-throated endorsement that we saw from Belarus, Syria, or the junta in Myanmar, is still definitely leaning in that neutral direction. And above all, Hanoi's official statements have emphasized the need to maintain restraint and avoided naming any actors at fault. And largely, you can see this as a similar reason that India has for maintaining a more neutral stance. And this is largely because Vietnam is the closest country in Southeast Asia to Russia, and particularly its arms sales and energy sector investments from Russia. So during the Cold War, obviously North Vietnam received substantial aid and support from the USSR, and then some of these ties continue to this day. Russia supplies Vietnam with significant amounts of military equipment, ranging from Kilo-class submarines to fighters to coastal defense systems and some ballistic missiles. And this is total about $7.5 billion in the last 25 years, or about 84% of Vietnam's total arms imports. And these are significant capabilities. This is what's driving Vietnam's military modernization, and it informs some of its approach towards turns with China. Secondly, Russian oil firms are actually quite active in the South China Sea offshore within what China has declared as the 9-dash line, now the 4 Shahs, in joint ventures with Vietnam's state oil company, which is kind of an interesting element given Russia's public acceptance of or neutrality of China's position on the South China Sea. So for Vietnam, these ties to Russia are viewed as a hedge against any sort of against the threat from China and in line with its more balanced foreign policy. It aims to avoid dependence on any one great power. That's why it pursues both ties to Washington and Moscow in a rough neighborhood, given its tensions with China and South China Sea and the historic rivalry between the two. And for the perspective of Washington and bilateral relations with both these partners, and the real issue here is that there is some lack. They're both sort of out of step with the U.S. response. But I think Washington understands that Thailand and Vietnam were never likely to abandon Russia or join in the sanctions regime. For Bangkok, it's the real challenge here is that there's a fundamental disconnect that's been growing since the 2014 coup in Thailand between the U.S. and Thailand. And these ties are remaining important, but I don't think that there's the relationship is as strong as it used to be. Although I would say the vote from Thailand in the UN is likely welcomed. Vietnam is is in actually even a trickier position, because while the Russian energy sector has not been sanctioned to the extent that other sectors have, the arms sales and Vietnam's dependence on them put Hanoi at risk of US secondary sanctions, which, as Michael mentioned, include CAATSA sanctions, because Vietnam has been interested in pursuing S-400 surface-to-air missile defense systems from Russia, as well as BrahMos cruise missiles. And if those purchases were to proceed in the future, you could see that there would have to be some sort of waiver from Washington, or these secondary sanctions might be applied. And so at the very least, the challenge, the sanctions on Russia, harm and hamper Vietnam's military modernization plans and potentially its energy sector in the long run. And from the perspective of the trajectory of the relationship, there is a bit of a blowback, in the near term. Obviously, I think the U.S. would love to see, its allies and partners get on board with its strong stance against Russia. But at the end of the day, as I said, Washington understands that neither of these countries were likely to depart from their relative non-alignment on this issue, and the strategic interest of the U.S. Maintaining strong relations with both countries does remain in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think I'll stop there and hand it over to the next speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Lucas. I will now turn it over to Bryce Wakefield, my predecessor at the Wilson Center, and who is now the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, for his views from down under.
Great, thank you so much, Shihoko, and it's great to see you. It's great to see Michael, who I used to work with as well, and to make new friends at the Wilson Center. It's a special place for me. I spent 4 wonderful years there. And yes, hello, Yoma from Canberra, which is the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people. Now, I've been asked to speak, of course, about Australia's response, and the response by Australia is pretty much what I think we should expect. There's been a widespread repudiation of the invasion, not only in international fora and in the Australian Parliament, but in public opinion as well. The Australian government has committed funding for what it calls lethal aid weapons that it will buy from NATO countries for provision in the Ukraine. It's committed funding for humanitarian assistance. It's signed on to the sanctions regime, and it has opened its borders to some 5,000 or so Ukrainian refugees. And that's not insignificant, of course, because this is a country where the refugee issue is quite a hot political issue. But I want to talk a little bit more about how this issue has been sort of enunciated within the current political environment, because Ukraine has, to some extent, allowed the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to situate, the conflict has been situated by the Prime Minister in a sort of current pre-existing foreign policy agenda. And what Americans should know is that this all takes place in the run-up to a federal election, where it's expected, according to current polling, that the Morrison government will lose. And a lot of commentators have said that even before Ukraine, that Morrison was attempting to make this what Australians call a khaki election, that is one where national security policies come to the fore. The government was seeking essentially to make national security a wedge issue, emphasizing difficulties with China and the government's record, forward-leaning record on dealing with China. The government essentially wants to be seen as tough on national security, and the opposition is trying its hardest to minimize the differences between the two parties. Now, this has resulted in some pretty feisty rhetoric. The Prime Minister, for example, called the leader of the opposition in Parliament, and he was repudiated for it and ordered to take it back. He called the leader of the opposition a Manchurian candidate. The Defense Minister has said similar things. So the invasion of Ukraine has been used to validate that narrative, the narrative of an Australian government that is tough on China. And this was seen in Morrison's first big declaratory act, if you like, after the Ukraine invasion, and that was a speech at the Lowy Institute think tank in Sydney. Morrison outlined what has been a theme in other countries as well, the difference between democracies and autocracies. He referred to China and Russia as consisting of an arc of autocracies, and he sought to conflate the two countries. Now, there are, I think, two political risks with this line of attack, if you like, by Morrison. It's sort of been mentioned here already. There's one internal risk and one external risk. The internal risk, I think, is that the conflation of Russia and China leads to a sort of lack of policy differentiation as to how to deal with these two countries. It should be remembered that China and Russia are very different states. I mean, Russia is more or less a kleptocracy, whereas China is a socialist market economy. So how we deal with these two countries, we have to have a certain degree of sophistication in how we deal with those two countries. The discussion on Ukraine is leading to all sorts of comparisons with Taiwan. We've heard some of them already. Some of those comparisons really don't wash, I think. I certainly don't think, for example, that China will update its own plans or thinking on Taiwan terribly much based on what's happening in Ukraine. Now, those internal risks I'm not so concerned about. Australian diplomats are fairly sensible people, and they can figure out that Russia and China are different countries, for example, and adjust their policies accordingly. But I think there is another risk in the external messaging, and that's been mentioned by Lucas already. Like Biden, of course, Morrison has sought to juxtapose democracies with authoritarian states, and there's nothing wrong with Australia and the United States engaging in robust democracy promotion. But when we turn that into a sort of geopolitical principle, it may well be counterproductive, especially when we keep in mind, as Lucas has said, that many of the states around the region that are in play, Vietnam, Taiwan, do not warm to such a narrative. And we've really got to sort of think about, which principles has Russia violated in this conflict. Morrison and Biden are focusing on democracy, but really the principle that has been violated in this conflict, the principle, by the way, which supports more than anything else the rules-based international order, is the principle of sovereignty. So, a focus on the violation of sovereignty, the violation of independence seems to be more warranted in my mind. And that sort of narrative focus on sovereignty is also useful in calling out Chinese hypocrisy, because if there's any principle that China tends to tends to emphasize, it is sovereignty and territorial integrity. And we've seen that principle violated by China's quasi-ally, Russia. I'll mention one other issue that Morrison mentioned in his speech, but because there was such a focus on the conflation of China and Russia and the principles of democratic practice and whatnot, it seems to have been lost. And that was the development of, or the opening of, a submarine base on Australia's east coast, which is a new development. Most analysts thought that base would be on the west coast. And I think that is strategically quite significant, and more significant than the acquisition of submarines themselves, because that was the acquisition of submarines is the kind of cornerstone of the AUKUS agreement. I'm a little bit skeptical, frankly, and a lot of defense analysts in Australia are skeptical about whether these subs will actually ever be built, given the technological challenges and the lack of capability in Australia. But the provision, or the opening of a base is potentially strategically significant, because it will allow US greater access to bases in the Pacific. And there hasn't really been much of a discussion about that because of the overriding discussion on the Ukraine. But this is something that the Australian public really needs to think about, whether it wants, for one thing, US nuclear attack submarines based in Australia. And there has to be a deeper discussion, I think, about what message it sends to Australia's neighbours. And I think I'll just end there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bryce. Sue, you've been incredibly patient. I'd like to bring in Sue Terry, Director of the Wilson Center's Korea Center, who will focus on the Korean Peninsula.
Thanks, Shoko. So South Korea's response began a bit cautious, weaker than Japan's response. While Japan imposed its own unilateral sanctions on Russia was right away, South Korea was not included on the Biden administration's initial list of allies aligned with the US in sanctions response. This initial hesitancy or caution is not all that surprising, because South Korea usually, historically, likes to keep its head down and focus on protecting its more narrow, specific economic and political interests, while doing minimum effort, just doing enough necessary to satisfy demands and expectations from the United States. So for example, in 2014, South Korea did not impose sanctions in response to Russian aggression in Crimea. But 2022 is not 2014, as the Moon Jae-in administration quickly realized. South Korea has changed. Its role has shifted since 2014. Its international profile, its soft power has increased over the years. And there was an international expectation, and more importantly, domestic public expectation and pressure for South Korea to respond to Russia's invasion in a more forceful way. As a 10th largest economy in the world with increased soft power, South Korea was expected to hold the line with US and EU rather than trying to duck for cover. So after starting out more tentatively, South Korea quickly then came into alignment with the United States and Europe and imposing sanctions on Russia and cooperating with the US and Europeans on sanctions measures, including on export controls on strategic items, electronics, semiconductors, computers, information and communications, sensors, lasers, and so on. South Korea has also committed to release additional strategic oil reserves to help stabilize the global energy market, and then consider other measures as well, including the resale of LNG to Europe. South Korea is also implementing export controls against Belarus for the support of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, from South Korea's perspective, the Ukraine crisis has created troubling new realities still that they have to deal with for its economic and strategic security. And these are challenges for South Korea in the coming months. First, on the economic front, South Korea, like the rest of the world, is concerned about, obviously, its impact on the global economy of the sanctions imposed on Russia, including supply chain disruptions and price spikes. Russia is South Korea's 12th largest trading partner. Overall value of the two-way trade between the two has increased tenfold from 2000 to 2021. South Korean automotive industry's presence in Russia, Hyundai Motor Group, South Korea's leading automaker, for example, currently has, it's the largest share of Russian automobile market. And, another problem for South Korea is that it has virtually no fuel resources. The South counts on Middle Eastern countries for all the bulk of oil and natural gas, but still imports 20% of its natural gas from Russia. So all in all, this economic consideration is quite big for South Korea. And they had 13 companies operating in Ukraine and about 40 companies operating in Russia. And secondly, on the security front, I would just say, South Korea is also cognizant of how Kim Jong-un, North Korea, is likely viewing this whole crisis. To the north, already, lessons from Saddam Hussein of Iraq and Gaddafi of Libya, their lesson was already clear, right? Leaders who give up nuclear weapons programs are at serious risk of being overthrown and killed. Now, that lesson is unfortunately reinforced by the current crisis between Ukraine and Russia. Watching the attack on Ukraine, Kim Jong-un can only calculate that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, they decide to give it up. That whole Budapest Memorandum was only 2 months after North Korea signed the agreed framework in 1994 with the United States. So, if Ukraine did not give up nuclear weapons, Russia would not dare to attack it, which makes it all the more for North Korea's determination to hold on to and expand nuclear weapons and missiles. So South Korea is very concerned about this aspect and implications of this, the fact that North Korea is going to double down its nuclear missile program, which they were already doing. And then I would just say, lastly, there's also a China factor, a little that's just in the back of South Korea's mind. China obviously abstained from UNSC resolution condemning invasion of Ukraine. In the past, Moon administration tried to walk this fine line between this American ally and China, sort of this hedging policy between US and China. China is South Korea's largest, biggest, #1 trading partner, and North Korea's only remaining patron. But South Korea did have recently held a presidential election. There'll be a new South Korean president coming in soon, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, who has promised to be tougher on both China and North Korea. So the expectation, all in all, is that South Korea will remain closely aligned with the United States and EU going forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. And thank you, Michael, Prashant, Lucas, Bryce, for your analysis from your areas of focus. So it's clear that the regional response to the war has been diverse, ranging from countries such as Japan and Singapore that have aligned closely with the United States and Europe, to India and Vietnam and hedging against taking a firm stance against Russia, to countries like South Korea that are grappling with yet another added layer to the North Korean threat as a result of the Russian action. What is clear too is that it's also led to introspection within countries as well. It has led to existential questions about state sovereignty, territorial integrity that Bryce outlined, and about the enforcement of the rule of law and international laws. It's also potentially opened up a Pandora's box about the effectiveness of nuclear deterrence and an escalation of an arms race in the region. There's a lot to unpack here, but I'm afraid we've actually reached our time. Just want to conclude that the situation in Ukraine continues to evolve. But whatever the outcome, whenever that ending may be, the war for survival that Ukraine is currently engaged in has already impacted the Indo-Pacific significantly, and not just economically, but also in assessing their defense and alliance strategies moving forward. We will, of course, continue to monitor and analyze these developments in Ukraine and their impact on the region moving forward. And I do hope you'll be able to join us for future discussions. Thank you for joining us today.